My name is Mamokgethi Phakeng. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the university, and as I said, this is my first inaugural lecture, the first inaugural lecture that I'm officiating at. And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to Professor Vawda's inauguration as full professor in the Center for African Studies. Inaugurations are often associated with politicians, and in the political context, an inauguration is a formal ceremony to mark the beginning of a major political leader's term of office. The inaugural address is a speech which the newly elected president or political leader gives during this ceremony, which informs the people of his or her intentions as a leader. Things are a little bit different in academia. It is generally believed that an inaugural lecture is a debt that a professor owes to the university community, which should be paid before they retire. Of course, in other cultures, they don't do an inaugural lecture, they do the last lecture. But here we do the inaugural lecture. In my view, however, an inaugural lecture should rather be regarded as a payment of some form of debt the community owes the inaugural lecturer who has risen to the level of full professor. During an inaugural lecture, the professor gives us, the university, an opportunity to showcase their work and put them in the limelight, even if it's only for an hour or so. It also gives us an opportunity as a university to say how delighted we are that the professor has chosen our university to work in. Political inaugurations often feature lavish ceremonies in which the politician publicly takes his or her oath of office in front of a large crowd of spectators. Fortunately, we in academia are not that lavish. And so we have planned this occasion to give Professor Vawda an opportunity to share his work so far and his intentions, perhaps, in his new role here at UCT as full professor. We are delighted that all of you have made time to join us in congratulating Professor Vawda and celebrating this important milestone at UCT in his career. While Professor Vawda has worked very hard to attain his professorship, there's no doubt that he also had a lot of support from his family and friends. And so I want to extend a special welcome to all of them who are here, the extended family, but more especially Professor Vawda's wife, Roxana Omar. Roxana, good to see you again, welcome. And their sons, Mikhail and Daniel. Welcome to the, I asked whether Daniel and Mikhail are here, because usually, children sometimes are dragged to inaugural lectures, so we're delighted to see you here. So you're welcome, and Professor Vawda's family, you're welcome here. We're delighted to have Professor Vawda, and we know what it means to be a professor, a full professor. Family sometimes take a strain. Sometimes all the time, you contribute to them being who they are today. So welcome, and I'm going to invite Professor David Waddle to introduce Professor Vawda, who's going to give us the inaugural lecture entitled The Provocation of Archie Mafeje. David.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. I think the Humanities faculty deserves a little credit for having this as your first inaugural. And I claim some credit myself for trying to make this inaugural lecture coincide with Professor Lungisile Nsebedza's workshop commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Archie Mafeje affair at this university. So that's a wonderful synchronicity that we've managed to produce. So my duty to introduce to you our speaker this evening. Shahid Vawda, after taking a BA at the University of Durban-Westville, went to the Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland and there secured an MA. And after that returned to South Africa to do his PhD at the then University of Natal. Before taking up academic positions, he worked in the trade union movement and at the educational NGO, the South African Committee for Higher Education Trust in the 1980s. And then as a consultant researcher for the post-1994 local, provincial, and national governments. He has taught and conducted research at various universities in South Africa, more widely in African countries such as Cameroon and Kenya, and even further afield in the United States and the United Kingdom. He has participated in projects in Côte d'Ivoire and Bangladesh, including participation in some UNESCO and International Council of Museums research workshops. He held positions as head of departments of anthropology at the universities of Durban, Westville and the Witwatersrand, and he was the head of School of Social Science at the University of the Witwatersrand. He's been active on the boards of the International Council of Museums Committee for History and Archaeology, the Public Affairs Research Institute, the Center for Critical Diversity Studies, the African Center for Migration and Society, and WISER, the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research. He was recruited to UCT in 2017 after the School of African and Gender Studies, Anthropology and Linguistics, more easily referred to as AXL, secured a major grant from the Mellon Foundation to fund a chair who would help to bring a diverse school together and lead interdisciplinary research. So currently, Professor Vawda holds the Archie Mafeje Chair in Critical Humanities and is director of the School of African and Gender Studies, Anthropology and Linguistics. Any glance at a website that features Professor Vawda will reveal the breadth of topics on which he's completed research projects. For example, trade unions in the 1980s, opposition and resistance politics in Natal, colonial and Islamic financial institutions and development. The list goes on. At the moment, something that came across my desk in the last few days is a major multi-institutional research project entitled Reconfiguring the Southern African Indian Ocean, History from Within, Looking Outside, AD 200 to 2000. A major project that I think will have some interface with his talk this evening. This project thinks about what preceded European colonization and capitalism in the Southern Indian Ocean and became entangled with it, and what proceeds with continuities and discontinuities. This is an exciting initiative of interdisciplinary research rooted in the humanistic social sciences that recenters the people and societies of the Southern Indian Ocean as active agents in the shaping of their historical and contemporary experiences. Tonight's inaugural lecture, The Provocation of Archie Mafeje, will focus on Professor Archibald Monwabisi Mafeje, the thought provoker. Mafeje's commitment to open, progressive, decolonial, Afrocentric scholarship challenges ready-made solutions to the development agenda and unresolved issues of inequality and injustice on the African continent. So, with great pleasure, Professor Shahid Vawda.
Before I start, I want to extend my condolences to the family of Professor Bongani Mayosi. This inaugural lecture is dedicated to the memory of Professor Mayosi and the excellence of his scholarship, his courageous leadership, and unwavering progressive public service. These are ideals that scholars such as Professor Mayosi and many others fought for at places such as UCT and must be expanded and defended. I also want to dedicate this inaugural to my late parents, Dr. Errol and Mrs. Ruqayya Vawda, and my immediate family, my greatest supporters, my wife, Ms. Ruxana Omar, and my sons, Mikhail and Daniel. I want to also acknowledge my wider extended family, many of whom are here today, and to those lineage and clan members who over the last century and more sacrificed much to advance the constitutional democracy we enjoy today. Monwabisi Archibald Mafeje is a well-known struggle icon, but more importantly, he was a provocateur who continues to challenge us today. Although he was born in rural South Africa, Archie Mafeje was equally at home in the cities across the globe. He was a man ahead of his time, and the full significance of his actions, his writings, and his lectures are still to be grasped. There is the familiar persona of Mafeje, the struggle icon, the revolutionary intellectual, the victim of racial prejudice and discrimination. But it is imperative, however, that we do not allow this historical character to obscure the multi-dimensional Mafeje, the scholar of this land and this university. We cannot allow his profound contribution to dissolve into myth or echoes of what might have been. Indeed, his relentless pursuit of scholarship, as Advocate Nsebezi mentioned this morning at the colloquium, is what I really want to focus on. So Archie Mafeje, the provocateur, whose commitment to open progressive scholarship challenged ready-made solutions, conventional ideas. Neither central committees nor academic comrades shackled his independence. He debated with the best minds of his generation and of the younger generation that followed him. While he was committed to freedom from colonial rule, to emancipation and progress and justice, but for him and for us, it is how we understand, analyze, and formulate alternatives that is critical. There is no quick and convenient answer, but that should not be constrained, or we should not be constrained by that complexity and as yet unanswered questions which are essential to the future of an Afrocentric research program. Now is the time to attend to the incomplete and unfinished intellectual tasks that he set, to reimagine his thoughts with our thoughts, and hopefully change the remnants of colonial frames of reference and make the necessary paradigm shifts that Mafeje called for so loudly. How to understand the societies in the globe, in the global world, and African societies in particular. What conceptual tools are essential to grasp the reality of African societies and their transformation both internally and in relation to others? Why is it necessary to critique colonialism and Eurocentrism? How do we explain the silences, the gaps, and the misrepresentations of African people? Why is it necessary to do both historical and sociological analysis of African people? What methods do we adopt? These are the kinds of questions that we probably ask any first-year student to consider. But I will suggest that Mafeje, the provocateur, confronts us intellectually and in our scholarship, and to reconsider these anew from an Afrocentric perspective. He was equally aware, woke, as some might say, and joined in both the detailed research and the vigorous debate about African societies and their intersocietal arrangements in both the longue durée and its contemporary entanglements with globalization, neoliberalism. But I'll come back to that in a short while. Let me just say, unlike many commentators on his work, that I did not know Archie Mafeje in person. Of course, I heard of him long before I knew him as a social scientist, as amongst those that took the hard road to exile. More pertinently, I knew him as a student of his work in the mid-1970s at the then University of Durban-Westville, the Bush College on the coast, East Coast, where his book Langa was introduced to us. It shattered the notions that African people lived tradition-bounded or embodied lives. Later, when I returned from my postgraduate studies, Mafeje's Langa, as well as the ideology of tribalism, alongside Ben Magubane's critical appraisal of the Rhodes Livingston Institute's ethnography on the Copper Belt, was on the reading lists of undergraduate students. Not only were these Black anthropologists, but they offered a completely different view from, at the time, the racist ethnos anthropology, liberal anthropology, and merging Marxist perspectives. I would like at this point to briefly diverge into a metaphor. I want to use something different, an equally provocative lens of art, the vividly illustrated parallel perspective that touches on the very issues that Archie Mafeje raised. So this is a painting by Johannes Pokela called South Pacific Seascape that plays on the notion of non-European primitivism and tribalism, lurid stories of cannibalism and European colonialism's burden of bringing enlightenment and progress to the colonies. Of course, the painting embodies the cynical asymmetries of wealth and poverty, or what Mafeje called the real economic and political power. But such works also make us question our worldview, our understanding of the world, and our perspectives. Is the book on the rock an instruction manual on seafaring, or oil extraction, or a diary, or the Bible? It is probably symbolically all of these elements. We need to ask of the inequalities of wealth and power. And we also have to ask, what is this set of foundational ideas, a Eurocentrism that underpins the arrogant takeover of another people's land and their society, regardless of the benevolent ideology of the white man's burden, and bringing the gifts, certainly in the late 20th century and 21st century, of difference and otherness. Eurocentrism represents a particular mode of inquiry underlined by three assumptions on the rise of the modern world. The first is that the origins of capitalism and modernity is a product of the internal dynamics and development of Europe alone. It is as if Europe was sealed off from the rest of the world, and aspects such as state development, democracy, the Renaissance, and capitalism are an entirely European phenomenon. It assumes that Europe's development is endogenous, self-fulfilling, and the prime mover of world's history. Secondly, this is contrasted with the rest of the world and casts the trajectory that the world moves from tradition to modern. And in this light, Europe is always in advance of others: Africa, Asia, the Americas. Thirdly, this gets expressed comparatively and sees the rest of the world as the others without history. And to attain historical destiny must pass through the same stages of development as Europe. This is an important set of conditions for which racism can emerge. And it includes what I've talked about earlier, the trope of primitivism. Although we as academics today increasingly accept that Eurocentrism as a myth, or at least critically question its precepts, the reality is that these assumptions and fallacies continue to be expressed, particularly in the popular press. This perpetuation of the Eurocentric view creates the conditions for which racism can emerge. And it includes the trope of tribalism that Mafeje critiqued. Needless to say, much of the 20th and 21st centuries, disparate groups of scholars have repudiated and challenged Eurocentric and modernist perspectives. This has given rise to lively debates about the origins of capitalism, their Eastern and African origins, and multiple modernities. Mafeje's work can be understood as among the first to question Eurocentric assumptions. It is certainly present in his first publications in the 1960s, on When a Chief Comes to Town, and in the book Langa. Of course, Eurocentrism has been questioned and pushed back on the basis of detailed studies of other civilizations associated with the rise of science and their mutual contributions to the rise of capitalism. Post-colonial studies have shown that history is not universal or homogeneous, but rather marked by heterogeneity and difference and their own forms of distinction, hierarchies, and inequalities. Based on what I have said so far, it's my task to sketch what I see as a research agenda relying on certain key ideas in Mafeje's work, which are provocative and intriguing. They are stated with authority, but leave the door open for us to walk through and embark on a future investigation, demanding considered, deeply contemplative responses. These, I hope, will incorporate and extend his central ideas into new areas of study with new perspectives, tied together by what academic discourse commonly refers to as meta-ideas or meta-theoretical frameworks. I identify four thematic concerns that Mafeje addressed. His critique of anthropology and colonialism, and in that I'll include his formative influences, alongside that of ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism. The second one is the idea of the primacy of Afrocentrism and decolonization. In truth, the positionality of researchers and their research. Thirdly, his ethnography, or his ethnographic method, which includes his concept of discursive interlocution. And lastly, the theory and the study of social formations, rather than a priori ethnic, tribal, or other taxonomic units such as the articulation of modes of production. It can be reasonably assumed that Mafeje's formative influences was the rejection of race as a biological or any imputed social significance. He understood it as an othering mechanism that draws attention away from analyzing urban and rural class formation that configures the master-servant relationships. Indeed, there is still much research to be done on what were his formative intellectual influences outside of the university environment. Othering was a central theme of his celebrated tribalism as ideology. His critique of tribalism drew from the informed ideas that gave impetus to deconstructing the system of racial superiority and economic dominance, and to recentering Africa and Africans. In passing, I just want to note that the critique of anthropology by Mafeje did not imply, as some commentators have suggested, that sociology or development studies or even new left Marxist sociology or political economy are are alternative core disciplines. Mafeje's critique was much more fundamental. All disciplines based on the Enlightenment ideas or ideals, which take Europe as the sole progenitor of rationality, of modernity, and the rise of capitalism, suffer, in his view, epistemological and ontological shortcomings. They do not have an African endogeneity as a guiding principle. In this context, the ethnographic work, Langa, is important. It is a book whose subtitle indicates that it investigates and reports on the social groups of the township. It is not some kind of cross-cultural setting, lamenting cultural dissolution under the onslaught of modernity, or making prophetic remarks about new bifurcated identities, such as the much-labored trope of urban as modern and rural as backward, and played out in such terms as townsmen or tribesmen, but rather as studying stratifications, divisions, and the context of conflicts. Simultaneously, an instance of a particular form of modernity, at once the outcome of colonialism, apartheid, and capitalism, and new forms of solidarity built from the existing webs of kingship, lineage, and friendship ties, but within the capillary sources of profit. In this sense, the political economy of everyday life in Langa, or any township, is not to render real people into analytical or abstract analytical categories, such as proletariat or migrant wage laborers, as some commentators have done. Rather, the historical mission of capital, in this instance, or the modern economy, as many people would put it, is only a partial universal domination in the Eurocentric sense. The legacy of a past accumulated cultural presence, or cultural capital, as some might call it, is sometimes an adjunct to exploitation and injustice, sometimes deeply implicated the perpetuation of unequal development, and other times is also the resistance to conquest and refuge from exploitation rather than reaction. In this sense, Mafeje's work indicates that those cultural resources uncaptured by the state may well be weapons of the weak, but also the platforms to build a civic or a trade union movement. I mentioned these issues in Mafeje's work, which have a direct bearing on broader post-colonial studies, particularly one of recovery and of critique of post-colonial modernity itself, in much the same way as Minolo or Dussel and his colleagues have done for Latin America. Where it differs from decolonial studies of the Latin American sort is that for most of them, their conception of modernity starts with the arrival of Columbus, or probably more directly with Cortez's conquests. For us in the southern tip of Africa, indeed for the rest of the continent, modernity has marched somewhat unevenly with historical developments in Europe and Asia. This can, for my colleagues in Maputo and in Antananarivo, push back the starting date somewhat to about the 2nd century AD. For others, it begins with the arrival of Arab traders on the coattails of Islam, and intriguingly, music from about the 7th century. For others, it might be Great Zimbabwe or Makumbugwe, and yet others, it might be the kingdoms that Mafeje analyzed in Central Africa. Suffice to say, it is a project that assumes no fixed dates, no stages of development, evolutionary or fixed historical starting or endpoints. Mafeje's work suggests that research that recovers and produces new knowledge in that empirical sense is urgent, but must also sharpen the conceptual and methodological framework. In his major work, The Theory and Ethnography of Social Formations, published by Codesria rather than any major academic publisher, is based on the Great Lakes interlacustrian polities before European colonialism, such as the Banyoro, the Bunganda, or the Ankole, amongst others. It is in this work that the empirical and the conceptual work come together in ways that open new avenues for research. In this lecture, it's not possible to give a summary of the entire book. Rather, I will just focus on a few key issues that inform future research. Mafeje prefers to talk of social formations rather than society or culture or states. Culture and society are key Enlightenment and, by extension, Eurocentric concepts. He talks of ethnography as the methodological entry point into understanding what these kingdoms and polities are about. He does not start with culture or tribe or ethnicity or some such putative homogeneous unit. He is highly critical also of the whole debate on the articulation of modes of production. Rather, he focuses on sound empirical research and asking questions in a process he calls authentic interlocution, to break with the standard ways of gathering data from people as the objects of inquiry. Rather, he treats his subjects of his research on their own terms, as if in the co-production of knowledge. It is a method that invites much debate, particularly in a school such as the African and Gender Studies, Anthropology and Linguistics school, but more widely in the humanities. What exactly is the knowledge that is produced in that way? This approach is by no means without its own African critiques. For those that want to follow that debate, I strongly recommend Nyoka's chapter in his recent 2017 PhD. But a major part of his book is a debate about the use and value of Eurocentric or ethnocentric concepts, such as those drawn from Marxist and Weberian frameworks, such as class or caste and feudalism. In the book, he seeks to empirically grasp what these regional kingdoms are like and question whether these kingdoms have state-like feudal structures, are susceptible to class analysis or class struggle more appropriately, and whether there's an appropriation of surplus for exchange, or we might say for markets, and whether there is such a thing as a transition to a capitalist economy. He also very clearly does not analyze one single kingdom as anthropologists normally do. Rather, he looks at a region. Such a regional analysis, he argues, can have replicability, such as in the kingdoms of Southern Africa. It is an important insight to which a group of us seek to develop, as was mentioned by the Dean, into a multi-site, multi-institutional research project. The direct empirical question he asks is, what is the relationship between the instance of power, as he calls it, in political organizations ranging from segmentary lineages to state-like kingdoms? What is their everyday social and political maneuvers whose dominant mode of existence is pastoralism or agriculture, or a combination of these economic activities? Using this methodology, he is able to reveal that relations of domination and subordination drove the economic activities through formal political power that resided in the institution of kingship, and that the aristocrats, depending on the particular points that they were in the production process, produced for use rather than for exchange. So for Mafeje, there was little or no market exchange, and hence it did not approximate anything like the feudal type of markets in Europe. The politics of the kingdom did raise the possibility of an endogenous state formation to effect greater surplus production before colonialism. Again, he points out that there were no feudal landlord-peasant type relations, which depended on an extraction through the control of land and labor. Livelihood provision in the interlacustrian kingdoms depended on a division of labor which was gendered and based on age. Any surplus was in the form of tribute. If I had to summarize the critical scholarship or the provocations that this produced, one is that tribe, race, non-Western civilization, as described in European scholarship, is a form of othering, and more important, leads inevitably to prejudicial and discriminatory actions and behavior towards the other. So is the notion of townsmen or townswomen. These categories of persons, traditionally used by European-originated social science, particularly anthropology, but including philosophy and economics, does not start from the perspectives and knowledge of the localized or the local colonized people, whether in the township or in the rural villages. An Afrocentric or endogenous approach must begin at this point. The local everyday activities and the common sense knowledge that people had of themselves and their social and natural environment. The researchers were interlocutors. Concepts such as feudalism or modes of production taken from a particular set of historical circumstances in Europe, specifically England, have no value. It is doubtful whether the English experience of the transition to industrial and agricultural capitalism, creating a landless proletariat, has any universal applicability, and less so in Africa. The specific forms of transitions from one kind of society to another in Africa still have to be retrieved from earlier debates. They have to be researched further and subjected to analysis and debate. Key here is Mafeje's notion of political maneuverings rather than market exchanges. And these are critical also to the development or the beginnings of exchange on a regional basis. Thirdly, Africa's history has a long and complicated, entangled experience with societies on both the African continent and elsewhere, with Asia, or what is today the Middle East, and with Europe. To discard all that history as a version or several versions of tradition or tribalism is both misleading and wrong. What is suggestive, though, in his work is that there can be an African modernity. Posing the question in this way asks us as researchers to look with a new lens from the inside out, rather than looking into Africa. It deperipheralizes, if there is such a word, and recenters Africa and its particular Southern Africa as part of other and larger regional social formations. He makes important observations about the internal the endogenous, when he talks about the interlacustrian polities, both before colonialism and after formal colonialism ended. Indeed, his observations about the aristocracy in these kingdoms as forming the incipient national petty bourgeoisie of the post-colonial states' politics are a way of beginning to re-look at post-colonial politics. In fact, at some point he proposes, contrary to popular formulations of state and citizenship in Africa, that there is no rural there is no rural autocracy that is relatively independent or autonomous from its democratic impulses. It's an important insight that needs further research. His most trenchant comments and criticisms are for the way in which the articulation of modes of production argument is deployed in South Africa. It was first proposed by Harold Walpe that the reason why the South African economy was successful was because capitalism articulated with the traditional, particularly the traditional as a rural distributive economy, producing cheap labor, that is, migrant workers with depressed wages, because their families were able to survive in the rural areas as subsistence farmers. Mafeje pointed out, firstly, redistributive economies is a concept of Western economists. It follows Weber and Polanyi and considers it to be marketless, stagnant, and non-innovative. Any passing acquaintance with rural areas in South Africa will confirm this as nonsense. Secondly, as the economy developed in South Africa, and moved through various cycles of contractions and expansion, more workers were literally dumped in the reserves with little ability to reproduce themselves. So the so-called traditional economy is also a figment. Thirdly, actual rural populations are very complex. They are no less complex than urban. They range from kin-based descent groups, lineages, clans, small-scale producers, cash croppers, subsistence farmers, and rural elites, none of whom are migrant workers that could be defined as classical proletariat in the European sense. The effects of such a theory are manifest to see today. From a misrecognition of the intimate connection between the urban and the rural settlements, to the infrastructural neglect, and more pertinently, the lack of a land strategy, and consequently, an inadequate land reform program. It is as if the rural is an undifferentiated labor reserve for the commercial agriculture and the mining and manufacturing sectors only. Critical in his provocations is the methodology he employs. The starting point, he insists, is what exists, the everyday practice and ideas of people, their social knowledge, that which is produced through interaction and social formation. Whether Mafeje is right or wrong, many of his propositions and hypotheses need to be tested. But for us, this is where we return to the sources of indigenous development that embodies what may be called our own modernity, even though at some point it was abruptly curtailed by colonial imperatives, underdevelopment, and unfulfilled modernization. Such a perspective does not discard continuities and traces of culture and language over the long durée into the present, and possibly whether at some points it abruptly dies out. Rather than return only, I'm going to skip. Oh. Rather than return only to sources of indigeneity, I propose a research program that reintegrates Africa, however unevenly, into several of world systems that prevailed both now and in the past. Such research has been prompted by scholars such as Chowdhury, among others. But their research traces an arc that stretches from the east going westwards and from the west going eastward. It hardly ever touches the southern part of Africa. And when it does, it is always from the outside looking in. I am suggesting what I call the Southern Indian Ocean. It is an area that I am now conducting research in, and on which Professor Waddle has mentioned that we have a huge project that is underway. The Southern Indian Ocean is at once the center and the periphery of world events. It has connections and entanglements in trade, in migration, and settlements that are intimately linked to intellectual conceptions of societies and states, to various categories of persons, both real and imagined. It can answer the question of what has been this region, this Southern Indian Ocean, this Southern Africa, active contribution to a modern globalized world over the last 2 centuries. I am not in any way suggesting that West Africa or Central Africa or North Africa are of any less importance. We are in Southern Africa, and it is this perspective that I am adopting. It is hoped that this vision, or this way of looking at things, will enable a variety of decolonizing movements and moments, and a greater comparative perspective of what connects us to Asia, and to Africa, to the rest of Africa, and to Europe. The research I envisage builds on the insights that Mafeje offers. Not only does it take issue with Eurocentric perspectives, but questions the dominant dual economy perspectives in Southern African studies, with its evolutionary perspective that there is a modern industrial economy alongside a tradition-bound redistributive one, with the latter playing catch-up with the former. Evidence of urban settlements on the coast of Eastern Southern Africa go back a long way, at least from the 5th century onwards. In the 12th century, trade, markets, and migration were central activities. This is not my map. This is from somewhere else. But it shows you what the world was like in the 12th century. And that, if you look closely, the major cities of the world were not in Europe. They were in Africa and Asia. Here, we say that markets and exchange were institutionalized social phenomena. Or to use Mafeje's language, they are part of a regional social formation. Indeed, the evidence of trade between Great Zimbabwe and Makumbugwe stretches inland, westwards. Because we always think of it starting somewhere in the Limpopo Valley and going eastwards, but also westwards, out into the ocean and the rest of the world. Its trade routes stretch over the Indian Ocean and both with the Islamic and Christian worlds. It is much more concrete and significant than we ever imagined. There are documents which suggest moneylenders from what is today Iran, financing trade with this part of the world. Just another map to show what it was like between 500 and 1000 CE. But it's not the trade routes per se that I'm interested in. It is about, or rather, the research group that I have, or that I belong to now. It is not the trade routes. It is, certainly from our perspective, what was mined, what was cast, what was made for trade, what was hunted as ivory, what were the commodities that were traded with, which groups engaged in this trade from within the societies of Southern Africa and with the groups that are along the coast and as part of the rest of the world. The point is that the dominant interpretive frameworks of this work, we know that this trade existed. The dominant interpretive frameworks create the impression, rather, that this is not the beginning, but the end of history. It is on the periphery. It is the least developed part of the more powerful players in the north. Furthermore, the coast is often treated as a foreign land, one that is not Southern African, nor East African, and whose access by Africans was limited. Increasingly, archaeological, anthropological, and historical evidence show that Southern Africa had a great deal of agency, both inland and on the coast, and it shaped the choices they made in their own development and in their relations with the rest of the Indian Ocean world. This invites research framed with an Afrocentric decolonial lens to revisit old evidence, as well as to generate new insights, to rethink and reconfigure the histories of the circulations of peoples, ideas, and commodities. The key empirical questions are: what is the idea of an endogenous settlement pattern outside of European influence? What was integral to the rise of urban settlements in the southern and western Indian Ocean and its hinterlands? It also raises fundamental questions regarding classes or specific groups within polities. What forms of alternative trade and manufacturing and distribution? What ideas did they have of surplus, of aesthetic styles and cultural forms? What of their architectural styles or the built environment? And what are the specific forms of intellectual, ideological, or cultural expressions that are pertinent to political authority, gender, trust, and reciprocity? It asks of us to understand these as social formations in the way Mafeje understood it, as modes of economic and social production and reproduction, as systems of exchange and of distribution and redistribution. It asks, to what extent were they part of various and previous phases of globalization? In what ways did they combine and contribute to their development, or indeed to their stagnation and demise? We have to understand the complex interweaving of modes of subsistence, forms of authority, their ideas, and their cultural expressions in both tangible and intangible spheres, within a wide set of connections and circuits of movements that preceded European colonialism and its entanglement, and discern what aspects that express continuities, discontinuities, and entirely new forms of social engagement and social assembly. Closer to home, such a questioning is almost demanding that the unstated dominant assumptions within Southern African studies will inevitably lead to revision. We need new analytical perspectives to provide new interpretations and drive new research and knowledge. Needless to say, none of the suggestions that I have made can take place without impeccable, original research. But they will give concrete expression to the Mafeje Chair's key vision to focus on Africa, the post-colonial world, the global South, and their role in the making and unmaking of disciplinary knowledges and practices. Thank you.
So thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, so whilst Professor Vawda held all of you spellbound, something happened. I became the Vice-Chancellor. But fortunately for me, and probably for you as well, I'm only the acting Vice-Chancellor. And Professor Pakeng had to excuse herself. She's got a flight to catch. I'm acting in her stead. And so I'm also continuing the proceedings tonight in her stead. And it is not my task to officially thank you, but I do want to express my own appreciation for this journey into the scholarship of Archie Mafeje. I think most of us know Archie Mafeje for being the figure that 50 years ago led to the first occupation of Bremner. And of course, we've seen a couple of others since then. But many of us do not know Archie Mafeje, the scholar. I certainly am not familiar with his work. And so, Shaheed, I have to thank you for taking us through this journey of true scholarship. And we know that his footmark stretches literally from Cairo to South Africa. And I think the mark of a true scholar is somebody that leaves ideas behind that one can further engage with. And I also want to congratulate you for taking up this invitation to further engage and to keep up the memory of Archie Mafeje through the work that you're about to start. But let me introduce Prof. Karuba, who will do the official thanks.
Thankfully, my job is an easier one, but it's a substantive job, so I'm not acting. So thank you, Acting Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Dean of Humanities, and thank you all for coming this late afternoon for this inaugural lecture. Thank you to all our colleagues, staff, academic and non-academic students, the Vawda family, both immediate and extended, and everyone that is here today. But above all, I think we should all thank Professor Shahid Vawda, who has presented an inaugural lecture befitting of the chair he occupies, and the hopes that were unleashed by the establishment of the chair. Most of the day today has been devoted to a symposium organized by Professor Lungisile Nsebeza, the AC Jordan Chair and Director of the Center for African Studies, in honor of Professor Archie Mafeje. And in this symposium colloquium, Archie Mafeje's pioneering contribution to the study of Africa his intellectual and political activism, and his legacy, his quest for social justice, all of these were highlighted, celebrated, and marked. And of course, 50 years since the sit-in, that we now call an occupation. You know, I had the privilege of discussing with a couple of people whom I have not asked their permission to be mentioned before coming in here. And it seems like 1968 also marks a global year of dissent of a particular sort. And someone was saying to me that they were born in 1968, and that in a rather unruly childhood, the parents would say to her, "Oh yes, that's May 1968. So the legacies of 68 live on, not just in Mafeje, but also globally beyond this local establishment. So I do not have anything more to add to these tributes and engagements and this global resonance of this particular day. So allow me, therefore, to say a few words about the inaugural lecture marking the establishment of the Archie Mafeje Chair in Critical and Decolonial Humanities. That's the full name of the chair. A chair located in the School of African and Gender Studies, Anthropology and Linguistics. Now, the significance of this chair coming to us as a deed through funding from the Mellon Foundation was very high on our minds when we put in this application. The period in which we put in the application to establish the chair was a period of great unease, both intellectually and socially, across campuses in the country. And the great call was for the decolonization of education and the decolonization of universities. And this call for decolonization, we thought we could ride on the coattails of these calls and establish something permanent within the humanities faculty to take the kind of scholarship that takes this seriously forward. And today, as you can see from this inaugural, our investment has amply paid off. Just to highlight a few things about this inaugural, unlike your conventional inaugural lecture, in which a newly minted professor outlines his contribution to his field of specialization, largely to a lay audience, and says a word or two about what he's likely to do thereafter, Professor Vawda's inaugural today is an agenda-setting inaugural, and it is centered on the significance and the challenge of the chair he occupies. And this is really important because rather than concentrating on his own academic contributions and achievements, and I think the dean did that in the short bio he gave before the lecture, what Professor Vawda does is to foreground Archie Mafeje as provocateur and to elaborate upon the intellectual provocations that Mafeje's intellectual work has for the decolonial present. In his own words, Mafeje was, quote, a provocateur who continues to challenge us today. In challenging Eurocentric biases in scholarship, rejecting the ordering of Africa, and emphasizing an endogenous Afrocentric approach to knowledge production, Mafeje was in many ways ahead of his time, and it is our duty, and certainly the chair's obligation, as he has outlined it, to pick up the mantle and continue the work from where he left. In setting up this research agenda for work under the Archie Mafeje Chair, Professor Vawda asked us to focus on a couple of things, to interrogate the perspectives from which our knowledge can, to reject the universal applicability of concepts and theories, to develop a frame of reference that centers us as producers of knowledge from a particular location in the world rather than simply consumers of concepts and theories that come from other parts. And as he puts it again in his own words, now is the time to attend to the incomplete and unfinished intellectual task Mafeje set and reimagine his thoughts within our thoughts. And I think this is a great line, to reimagine his thoughts within our thoughts and hopefully change the remnants of colonial frames of reference and make the necessary paradigm shifts Mafeje called for so loudly. End of quote. Now, I believe that this is the task of the critical and decolonial scholarship that Professor Vawda's vision of the Mafeje Chair has outlined for us today. And the challenge each one of us has to take up in this scholarship is to ensure that we follow the path that is mapped out for us today and to re-examine our perspectives and our location in the production of African scholarship going forward. So once again, I want to say thank you to all of you who have come here today. There are too many names to mention, too many friends, too many colleagues I see from other parts, other universities. And I just want to say that we recognize all of you and very thank you for your having come today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Gruber. Now, traditionally, there is no questions and answer sessions after an inaugural lecture, but we do invite you to join us outside for a drink and a snack and to use that opportunity to engage with Prof. Vawda on his lecture. I also want to mention that we have in the audience 3 of the original sit-inners of sit-downers, as Professor Garuba calls them, occupiers of Bremner, and we have some of the more recent occupiers of Bremner. So perhaps you may find some points of interest also as we go outside. So we will now leave, and we will meet you outside to talk about this wonderful lecture further. Thank you, Professor Vawda, once again.